Great to have you back here on the morning show on the Rise News. I am Adesoa Omorwan.
And I'm Rafah Hosseini.
Africa over the past 50 years, between 1963 and 2013, focused her collective interest on the decolonization, the struggle against apartheid, and attainment of political independence for the continent.
During the Golden Jubilee of African Union in 2013, the continent rededicated herself to the attainment of the Pan-African vision of an integrated, prosperous and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens, representing a dynamic force in the international arena.
Indeed, the African Union Agenda 2063 is the blueprint and master plan for transforming the continent into the global powerhouse of the future. It is Africa's strategic framework that aims to deliver on Africa's goal for inclusive and sustainable development, and is a concrete manifestation of the Pan-African drive for unity, self-progress, self-determination, freedom, and collective prosperity pursued under Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance.
Joining us now to discuss the topic, African Union Agenda 2063, is Gogontlejang Phaladi, a native of Botswana and a panelist on the ongoing African Union program in Nigeria. She's also a founder of Pillar of Hope Project. Welcome, Gogontlejang.
Thank you very much for that attempt at pronouncing my name.
I can imagine. I mean, no matter how you tried, you still used to get stuck. But let's go straight to it. I mean, Botswana is sort of like a poster child, for what African integration is, because when you remember the efforts of Seretse Khama as regards the unity of Africa, and breaking away from the norms, the tribal norms that hold Africa back. Take, for instance, Seretse Khama lost his kingdom in the bid to marry the woman of his dreams and the woman he truly loves. And that formed, the emergence of the new Botswana nation. Would you think that most Africans out there have those tenets of Seretse Khama?
I think we actually do, because Seretse Khama's first president is a Pan-Africanist, and African countries, well endowed with many Pan-Africanists, great leaders. You look at Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, Nkrumah, and all of them. They all had their different ways of influencing their country's development nexus, post-colonialization, and from different angles. But I definitely think that we have really strong Pan-African leaders that even today, their ideologies are still relevant to transforming Africa and Africa's progress. And I think one of the saddest things is that, in Africa, we have many different tribes, and tribes are meant for us to be able to celebrate our different identities, our diverse heritage, cultures, and all of those, and are actually supposed to unite us. But it's quite sad that these have become a major source of divisions across Africa, and to a large extent, tribalism has been politicized and has been a major driver of conflicts and instabilities in many African countries. So I think this basically calls for us to go back to our roots and look at what our Pan-African forefathers, our founding fathers, envisaged when they talked about African unity and Pan-Africanism, and to see where we missed a step when we started politicizing, using our tribal, our different diversities and our differences to do evil as opposed to uniting us. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board, because I still think there's a lot in our African heritage and our tribal cultures and practices that should not be lost, but we should also be very careful to ensure that these are not weapons that divide us and, of course, regress our transformation as Africa and Africans.
So you do see this as impediments to Pan-Africanism. And I'm asking to stress this because just yesterday we had Dr. Kevin Kewe here, and he says language, currency, culture cannot be barriers. He doesn't see them as barriers. Are they barriers to a borderless Africa, a United States of Africa?
Yes.
They are.
They are not supposed to be barriers, but the way that these have been interpreted today, they have become impediments. So, the fact that right now tribalism is being used to drive really divisive narratives and politics and all of those things. It means that what was meant to actually be a source of unifying us as Africa, we've actually used it as a weapon against our very own self-determination, our own Pan-Africanism, solidarity, and all of those things. So in the ideal sense, they're not supposed to be things that are impediments to our progress. They're not supposed to be things that divide us. They're not supposed to be the reason why right now there are ongoing civil wars in countries like DRC and all of those things. They're supposed to be our own source of identification as Africans, one that we use to distinguish ourselves from what the history that our colonizers left for us, you know. But I think there are certain people who hold positions of influence, and they're using that influence wrongly to drive really divisive narratives. I mean, honestly, in Africa, we shouldn't be divided by our tribes, our mother tongues, and all of those things. This should be our sources of strength and the way we distinguish ourselves from the history that was left by our colonizers. So I think we need to really be careful in pointing out that these are not ideally supposed to divide us, but there are certain people who drive very divisive narratives, and we as civil society must really defend, not just civil society, but even custodians of culture, custodians of tradition and African practices must really come out and defend our heritages and say we are not going to use this to divide ourselves. No to tribalism, no to politicizing our tribal diversities, no to politicizing all of these things, and saying we are going to use these as our own source of strength as African and promote Pan-Africanism.
The former Nigerian national anthem, there's a part in it that I always quote that says, "Though tribes and tongues may differ, in brotherhood we stand."
Yes.
That is still far from the realization of where Africa ought to be. And I'm saying that vis-a-vis the understanding of the future of Africa. I think it was Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara that said profoundly that we must dare to invent the future.
Yeah.
How are we juxtaposing the diversity and the future we want in Africa?
Definitely. So, you know, I always say that I refuse this narrative that, you know, our identities as Africans, our diversity is actually a major source of division, and then we should completely do away with it, because I think it's just the narrative that is being pushed by certain interests, whether it's our former colonizers or those who are proponents of that, who are pushing those narratives, you know. But historically and going back, these have always united us. And I think, you know, when you look at African proverbs, you know, we have proverbs such as "it takes a village to raise a child." And obviously in that village, you're going to find diverse groups, diverse cultures, diverse practices. But for us to have such a profound proverb as "it takes a village to raise a child," it means that despite our differences, our diversity, we all agree that every member of society, every stakeholder in society has a role to play in raising a child, in developing and transforming our respective countries and societies. And there's so many cultural values that are very important in Africa. Right now, when we talk about democracy, it's often as though democracy is something that comes from the West, you know, as though as Africans we didn't have any form of democracy, any form of governance. And if you ask me, I'd say we had a really organized form of governance and democracy. When you look at countries like Botswana and Ghana, our customary system has been said to be the oldest form of democracy, way before any sort of common laws, English laws, Dutch laws, and all of those came. We already had mechanisms in place that ensure that we have the respect for the rule of law, respect for authority, all of those things. You know, whether you go into the healthcare system, you find that many of the practices that we have in Africa that have been adopted into Western or modern medicine are actually practices that started as part of our African culture and tradition. I think I was reading an article some months ago that actually the first successful C-section, or even that procedure, is something that started in Africa. You know, I think one of the things we need to realize is that our biggest problem in Africa is that we are not storytellers. we don't write our stories. If you don't write your story, somebody else is going to write it for you, and they're going to write it in the perspective and the context that favors them. And this is why many things we read about Africa are about shunning our culture, our practices or whatnot, because we don't do literature that promotes our own Pan-Africanism, our own ideals, our practices. We don't write literature that celebrates our leaders. Right now, my 10-year-old niece would know about Mussolini, would know about Hitler, would know about Abraham Lincoln and all of that, but would not know Thomas Sankara, would not know Patrice Lumumba, because we don't write, we don't document, we don't tell our stories. So the only perspective that's there is that our cultures are bad and all of those things.
Interesting that you brought that perspective, because you know what they say, he who detects the piper.
Yeah.
He who
calls the piper.
Plays,
yes,
detects the tune.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in achieving this Pan-Africanism we're talking about, the African Union came up with 20 goals to meet for 2063. And I was going through those 20 goals, very interesting. It's talking about healthy and well-nourished citizens, education for all, skills revolution, inclusive growth. But there was one particular one that caught my interest, and it was Africa taking full responsibility for financing hard development.
Yes.
That particular goal, is it achievable? Because when you look at it, there's a lot of attractive loans coming from China these days, and African countries are feasting on it uncontrollably. And 2063 is just about 40-something years down the line. The first 10 years of the goal is 4 years away from being over. Are there even measurable goals? Are we doing anything? Are there things in place? But that particular goal, do you think is achievable? Can Africa self-fund its development and then tell its own story?
Yes. I think the very direct answer is yes, it's absolutely achievable. I think one of the things we need to realize is that Africa is not reliant on funding because we are incapacitated. Africa is fully capacitated financially in terms of human resource to be able to contribute to all its development sectors, whether it's human and social development, health, industry, all of those things. So the biggest problem is not that we lack capacity or even financial capacity to fund our own development plans, and all of that. Is the biggest problem we have in Africa are governance deficits. Right now, the total money that we lose to corruption and looting every year is actually more than the development funding that we receive. And that alone should show you that we actually have sufficient financial and human resource. The biggest problem is governance deficits. You know, often when we come up with treaties, visions, and aspirations like Agenda 2063, which is a great, well-written strategic framework for transforming Africa. I think one of the things we forget to really clearly define is the kind of leadership that is needed to drive that development strategic framework. Because if you put here a vision and it's well articulated on how we want to transform Africa, where the GDP should be, we want to be high-income countries and all of those things, you don't put the kind of leadership that is needed to drive that transformation, then you're seriously going to have a problem, you know. So we have a lot of structural reforms that need to happen before we can achieve Agenda 2063. One of the things we need to do is that we need to move away from building strong men to building strong institutions, because many countries in Africa, even my country included, we have a problem of wanting to have strong men, strong women, and not having strong institutional capacity. When you have strong institutional capacity, you don't have to have a rock star president who's going to fight corruption, because already the institutions that are in place in the country will be able to protect the citizens from looting, from corruption, from maladministration, and all of those things. So we need to really move from building strong personalities to strong institutions. And then the other thing is that many leaders convened in Addis Ababa.
Okay. Just to let you know, we're going on a short commercial timeout really very soon. So I'll just call you to that once we get through to the break.
Great.
All right? We can go through the break now. We'll be right back in no time.
Welcome back to the Morning Show here on the Rise News. We still have in the studio with us Miss Phaladi, a native of Botswana and a panelist in the ongoing African Union program here in Nigeria. Thank you for staying with us. Just to land on your thought, because I was asking you if Africa is ready to even meet these goals in 2063, and you were talking about
The governance deficits, yes. So I think we need to rectify the governance deficits. Another thing that I feel the African Union and maybe all of us should push for is for domestication, because this is a treaty that has been made by the AU with the leaders and many of us involved in the consultative processes. But you need to know that, like many other frameworks or treaties that exist, they rely on the goodwill of the president who is in power at that time. And, you know, these are things that we cannot necessarily hold governments accountable for unless they are domesticated. And I think that every government, every country in Africa should actually domesticate Agenda 2063 and make sure it is aligned to our national development plans. Because when it's aligned to the national development plan, number one, it will be budgeted for. So all of these targets, indicators that are reflected there, they'll be budgeted for implementation. Number two, as civil society, we can hold government accountable for saying that you committed to this target on healthcare, to say maybe you have reduced or completely eliminated transmission of HIV from mother to child, and so on and so forth. So I think it's important to push our governments to really domesticate Agenda 2063.
You talk about, sorry, Rufai, I know you want to jump in here. You talked about strong men and strong institutions. A lot of people will say they cannot, you know, they coexist. You cannot have one in isolation. And you also talked about the people.
Yes.
And strong institutions. And I wanted to ask you, from what you've seen so far, are the African people desirous of building strong institutions? Have you seen enough to say the African person is interested in strong institutions rather than strong men and women?
Going to the fact that they say the people get the leaders they deserve.
Exactly.
Exactly. I mean, you know, I don't think that if you ask that question to just an ordinary citizen, if you're just passing by, they will necessarily say, yes, we want strong institutions. But if you ask people, would you want to be able to fight corruption in your country? They'll say yes. Do you want to have healthcare and clinics and hospitals within 5 kilometers radius to the next person? They'll say yes. Do you want to be able to graduate and not spend another 5 years unemployed with your engineering degree and all? They'll say yes. You know, so they may not necessarily understand that all these things are manifestations of having strong institutions to enable such economic, human and social development progress in a country. But definitely when you look at the challenges that you face and you ask anybody, do you want to have them do you want to overcome them? They'll say yes, you know. So I think it's important that we really push for strong institutions. Yes, they go together with having strong leaders, you know. My problem is that we shouldn't come, when we have a leader who's an exemplary leader on the continent, let's say the leader of Rwanda or the leader of Botswana, you know, it's great that we celebrate such great leadership, but it's also important that we reflect on what is the institutional capacity in that country that enables them to do all of that. You know, earlier on this year, our president was being celebrated for taking to task some of the leaders in parliament who are corrupt officials and all of those things. And I think the most famous one was when a former director of the Intelligence Security Services was arrested at the airport. And, you know, that is really fantastic. But beyond that, we shouldn't do that just because we have a great leader. We should do that because we have institutions that can do that. So in the absence of a leader who can be able to take such corrupt leaders to task or to court, we should have the Directorate on Corruption and Economic Crime and all other institutions being able to do that on behalf of the citizen. So this is why I'm saying that you have strong leadership, but having strong institutions is very important. Especially just something to mention. I think one of the problems we have in Africa, we don't have a culture of accountability. And that is the problem. You know, sometimes I feel like we live in an Africa where we as electorates, we are accountable to the people we elect, you know? So people don't know that we have to hold our leaders accountable, and you don't hold them accountable just a few months before elections. Just the minute you elect them into office, you have to start holding them accountable. But you know, sometimes because of our African culture, when you ask questions, they say you're being rude, you're being disrespectful, or maybe in Africa, we say in Africa, there's no hurry, you know, give him time and all of that. Next thing is 20 years and nothing has been done.
But I want to ask you this question and look at the perspective, because as we talk about 2063 with a lot of joy, there are still some African countries that might not join us at that time that are not free. And I'll give you instances. Recolonization has started all over again with the Chinese agenda. Take, for instance, what is happening in Zambia. Public debt financing. The government of the country is pretty much crippled. The Chinese are taking everything, the ports and everything owned by the Chinese. Newspaper dailies are being published in Chinese in Zambia as we speak today. Another country that comes to mind is what is happening in the Congo. It's a free-for-all. The new president, Tshisekedi, is in there, but it doesn't stay in the presidential palace. The former president still stays in the presidential palace. And there's a back and forth. See what is happening in Guinea. A loan that is 2 times the national GDP of Guinea, about a $40 billion loan, was given to the Guinean government by the Chinese. Africa is not still free.
No.
So how do we meet this 2063 target if Africa isn't free?
Yes. You know, the other time I was talking to a friend and I say that, you know, one of the things that we need, the conversation we need to have in Africa is how to liberate ourselves from our liberators. Because many of the things that are not going right in Africa is at the hands of our liberators. You know, sometimes a person who has liberated you may not necessarily be this person fit to now take you to the next step of transformation, you know. And this is why I often say that one of the best and biggest lessons that African leaders can learn from Nelson Mandela is that he became a president for 1 term and then he decided to leave because he just could see that, you know what, where South Africa is going, probably somebody else could take it from where I have left off, you know. But now we have liberators who are now the biggest problem we have in Africa, you know. And I think one of the things I find very hard to digest is how it's easy for a foreigner from out of the continent to come to any African country. First of all, many of them don't need a visa to arrive in that country, as opposed to any other African national. You know, if right now somebody from America wants to go to Botswana, they don't need a visa. But you as a Nigerian, you need a visa and you go through a very lengthy process to get that visa. It's easy for a foreigner to come into any African country than it is for any other African. It's easy for a foreigner to come and set up a business in any other African country than it is for an African to do that. And these are things that are really, really problematic. And you know, I think the problem is that our leaders are not safeguarding that space for the people of that country, but also for Africans at large. And this is why the role of civil society is very important. Many of our leaders in Africa are perpetrators of governance deficits, literally. Many of our leaders in Africa are also not held accountable by us as the electorates. You cannot expect somebody who is doing wrong to hold themselves accountable.
How do you hold somebody accountable, the leadership accountable, where free speech is being stifled? How do you hold the leadership accountable where you get out there on the street, and we've seen this all over Africa. See what happened in Sudan, for instance. You get out there on the streets to protest, you're being killed.
You don't
see
even
what
need to get out sometimes. The social media,
see what is happening in Tanzania, that the bulldozer Magufuli is killing, is alleged to be killing a lot of people, and they see their bodies wash up above the stream because you're in opposition.
Exactly. You know, you cannot necessarily take a step back and say that the environment is toxic and people are being arrested, internet is being censored and all of that, so we have to leave the status quo. I mean, part of a revolution, it has never happened in a comfortable state. A revolution has never happened without a certain level of violence. I'll tell you one of the problems we have, and I was talking with, I came here with a colleague from Zimbabwe because both of us had a visa problem, so we only came a day later to this meeting, you know. And one of the things we're talking about is that we don't have Pan-Africanist or revolutionary leaders like the ones we used to have in the likes of Thomas Sankara, who are willing to literally put their lives on the line for the change we want to see. Because that's the only way we do it. And then the other thing, you know, if you want to effect change...
Well, the first president of Zimbabwe was a revolutionary.
Exactly, but he overstayed his welcome. This is why I'm saying they need to take a leave from Mandela, because many of them have overstayed their welcome. Whether you go to Uganda right now, you go to West African, Francophone countries and all of that. But, you know, let me tell you one of the problems we have, and I say this to young people, because young people, we are the majority in Africa at the moment. Like about 60% of the population of Africa is young people. One of the biggest problems we have as young people is that we don't organize effectively. We don't organize effectively. Even in my own country, Botswana, The other day, I went on Facebook and I was really upset to say that, you know, and many of us would put up a rant on social media, get retweets, get likes or whatnot. When you tell people, let us come together, let us do a petition, nobody shows up. There's a minister in my country who is a GBV perpetrator, and people wrote a petition, 3,000 signed for the president to remove him from the gender ministry because now he's the minister of gender. And over 3,000 people signed that petition for that minister to be removed and be taken to another ministry or completely out of cabinet. And then on the day they were supposed to hand in the petition, do you know how many people showed up? 3 people. So you look at some of these things, we don't organize effectively. We don't also understand the power of numbers. Because for me, I always believe that no matter how much a leader is a dictator, you can never, ever refuse to listen to the majority. A whole shutdown of a country, completely crippled, to say we are not doing anything until you listen to our demands. And I can tell you, as a young person who's been doing advocacy for a very long time, there are many spaces where we had opportunities to mobilize to that point where we can be heard, but we didn't capitalize on those moments. That's how it is.
I like that you've brought in this aspect of it, the young people. Because when you look at 2063, 50 years plan, a lot of it, the actualization of these goals falls on the shoulders of the young people of today. But do they understand their role in all of this? Are they even participating enough? So
I think we are definitely not participating enough as young people, and the popularization of this is very low. I mean, I can tell you in my country, Botswana, if I just take a walk even at the university and I ask a student what is Agenda 2063, there's a huge likelihood that they would not be knowing what Agenda 2063 is. Or if maybe they know, they wouldn't know what it's about, what it means, or why they should be concerned about that. So there's very low popularization of some of these really important instruments. You know, it's the same as the Africa Free Trade Movement, all of these things that are very important. And you know, this is why accountability is difficult, because you can't hold your leader accountable for what you don't know. There's definitely a lot
to talk about, Phaladi. We'll come back to talk about how we can begin to get the young people involved. Right after this break. Please join us again. So great to have you back, join us on the Morning Show here on Arise News. Phaladi, a native of Botswana and a panelist at the ongoing African Union program here in Lagos, Nigeria, is still with us in the studios. A very interesting conversation. And the role of the young people in achieving Agenda 2063 was what we're talking about. You feel that young people don't even know enough to do enough. So how do we get them to do enough?
I think one of the things we have to do is that when you have young people like myself who has the privilege of being privy to such information, and I have an opportunity to come all the way to Nigeria for a capacity building meeting on Agenda 2063, I have a responsibility to go back and impart this knowledge among my constituents, whether it's in a small space at the university or in my community and all of that. So a lot of AU, the UN, they spend a lot of money flying young people all over the world for capacity building workshops and whatnot. We come back and that knowledge is kept among ourselves. So that's the first thing. Let us hold ourselves accountable. Second thing is that the young people in respective countries, we need to go an extra mile to empower ourselves. You know, I always say in my country when I talk to young people, and many of them are complaining that, okay, the minister's not doing this, this is not happening. And I'm always like, how many of you have actually had an opportunity to interact with your members of parliament? Because Botswana is a country where we are privileged that we can have access to our members of parliament. Sometimes we even have an audience with our president, which is something that I know doesn't happen in many countries. So I often ask them, how often do you have an engagement with your member of parliament? When a bill is being debated in parliament, how many young people are willing to take just 1 hour of their time to go to the National Assembly, to go and listen to the debates, to go to the council chamber, to go to how many of us are willing to spend just a little money to buy the government gazette, just to know what bills have been passed, what bills are currently being discussed in parliament, all of those things. So when you don't engage in those things, when your MP or councillor calls a meeting for young people, a town hall meeting, or is in your constituency asking for a vote, how do you engage with them constructively when you are not aware of these processes? We are living in an era where we are well endowed with knowledge. Literally any information about Agenda 2063 is a tap away. When you're on social media, how are you using that platform? For me, a lot of the things that I do on advocacy, I just manage to get through just on social media. I tag my president, I tag the government, the first lady. They respond because many leaders now are on social media. So how do you use that time? Are you using it just to be retweeting and whatever, engaging, hello, taking a picture of your food, which is fine, by the way, no offense, you know, but it's about also how we're using the leverage that we have as young people, the time that we have, because that is our only currency. And then the last thing is that, are we supporting young people who are running for office? I always say that we can sit here and negotiate that young people should be meaningfully engaged and power processes, which is all great. But the only way for you to secure power where you don't have to negotiate and your voice will be heard is through decision-making platforms. Young people are running for political office. We are the ones who ridicule them. We don't help their countries.
That's a good segue for me, because I wanted to take you up on some issues. We're saying Africa has a future 2063 and things like that. The power of young people. We see what's happening with Bobby Wine in Uganda, for instance. We see what's happening in South Africa. It's shocking that South Africa, a country that has a large population of young people, unemployment rate about 15%, the economy is dwindling. We've had technical recessions here and there. You have somebody that is the leader of the DA, that is a young person, that is in his 40s, but the South African young people are not looking at that. We had lots of young people in the last Nigerian elections. Go to Ghana, go to Zimbabwe. We have young people everywhere. But you can see the repression they're facing. They stand up to power. A lot of them are docked in cells. How do we organize?
Yes. I think one of the things we need to understand is that leadership does not exist without sacrifice and compromise. So if you're a leader, you need to know, first of all, you're making yourself vulnerable to such things. There's no leadership that does not come with something to give anywhere. And very unfortunate, in sad cases, it has resulted in death, you know. But everywhere in leadership, when you push a movement, something has to give, you know. I always give an example of the fees must fall, and I think that is a very good example of
Stellenbosch.
Yes, a very good example of youth organizing, pushing, and just making that demands heard, you know. And many of them are even in jail to this day, and the student representatives are still trying to engage with President Cyril Ramaphosa for a plea for them to be pardoned and to be released. But, you know, these are things you need to expect in leadership. And I always give example of myself. One of the things that I had to compromise as a leader is that I got set out of school simply because of my advocacy work and activism and all of that. I lost a scholarship and I lost my university. At this time, I'm still in university, while people I started university with have already graduated and already probably started their professions. And it's only me that I had to lose a couple of years of my life during that period. So you need to know that leadership does not come with compromise and sacrifice. It does not come with vulnerability. And this is why we need such leadership. This is why we have revolutionaries. This is why we have great leaders and so on and so forth. And we must not tire or fear from being able to demand what we know should rightfully be ours. And, you know, in the face of all odds, I believe those who love their countries, those who love Africa, will actually transform it.
Do people really still love Africa? Do they still love their continent and their country?
I don't know about you.
No, but I'm saying the young people pervasively, do they still love their country?
Yes. So
do they still have that sense of patriotism?
Or they're eloping to Europe?
Yes. One of the biggest problems we have with organizing, as you're saying, why is it that we're struggling with organizing, is that people have really lost faith in Africa and our countries and systems. And one of the things, the best reflection of that is voter apathy. A lot of young people don't go to vote because they feel that their votes are in vain. They're like, they're going to rig. We already know the outcome and all of that, you know. So a lot of young people have lost faith in Africa, and this is why I think it makes it very difficult to organize. But this is why we need to continue to bring back that sense of social responsibility. You know, if at all we had completely given up and said that this would never happen, African countries would not have been able to break free from colonialization. I know neo-colonialism is another issue, but we wouldn't have been able to move from that. So I think the most important thing is that we need to keep pushing. We need to empower ourselves. We need to organize, or otherwise we will agonize. We are not outnumbered. We are just out-organized in Africa. So I think we need, as young leaders, I challenge myself to say that, how do we ensure that a young African, whether in Lagos, in Gaborone, in Johannesburg, they still have faith in knowing that their power, they have the power to actually inspire the change and transformation that they want to see in our respective countries.
Well, they can learn from your story, and I want to dwell a bit on that. The time you had to give up, the sacrifices you made, would you say it has paid off? Have you seen the Africa of your dreams now? Yeah.
So this sacrifice, what was at a country level, and I would say that. First of all, the reason why I had an issue with my university at that time is because, so in Botswana, the government, I'm sure you all know, pays, education is free. Even at the university, the government pays for your fees and all of that, you know. But one of the conditions at that time was that you're not allowed to work or do any form of anything else apart from just being a student. And I told them that this is quite counter-progressive and is preventive. In these really tough times where you graduate and the only thing you have is a certificate, no experience, no exposure, nothing, I think it's actually very primitive for you to expect students who work and do nothing at all. And they gave me an ultimatum to say that it's either you're going to just stay in the university or you'll continue with your other things, and I decided to choose to continue with the work that I do in advocacy, and they terminated my scholarship. But now in Botswana today, the government no longer prohibits you from working or engaging in any other form of work while you are in university, because they realized that this was actually, I mean, it didn't make sense. Everywhere in the world, even in Ivy League universities, students work for money, for exposure, for experience, for many things, you know.
Contact,
so you know, I think one of the things we also need to know is that advocacy works, but it's not an event, it's a process. Because some people would go and toy or march for a certain thing, and then if it doesn't change, they're like, this is pointless. It doesn't. It took 4 years for my organization doing advocacy, pushing the government to procure sanitary towels for girls in schools. 4 years.
4 years.
And after that, that's when the government, on the 4th year of us doing that advocacy, that's when the government said they would procure sanitary towels for girls in schools. So we need to know that these things do not happen just like that, but it needs to start now. It needs to start now. Everybody has a role. And if we are 70% of the population of Africa, tell me which leader would not listen to 70% of the population.
Short attention span,
no.
young people.
It has to be long term.
No. And I just want to go back to the 2063 agenda and looking at those goals, which I'm sure you do know them. You've said they are achievable, but do you think that we have our priorities right? And if we were to reprioritize, what should it be in achieving those goals? Are there faster ways? Do you think that this can be done faster than 2063? Yes.
I think one of the things that there are certain, like you said, there are many goals and priorities, but there are certain things that need to be done because they enable for others to happen. I think one of the first priorities is on the governance issue, because we really have a problem with corruption, economic crime, and I think it's important that we accelerate working on rectifying the governance deficits in the country, strengthening the institutions that are supposed to ensure progressive governance, democracy, strengthening the electoral system and all of those things, you know, and especially responding to corruption and looting in Africa. We really need to see prosecutions of high-level
priority.
Prosecutions of high-level authority, because you know what, we always have news headlines, and I think the media does a really great job of informing us of all of these things, but we're not seeing prosecutions, we're not seeing convictions. Most importantly, we are not seeing the money being returned. One of the things that I recommended to AU when they had a meeting in Botswana is that I think AU should set up an asset recovery mechanism at that level, and even an anti-corruption court at that level, where if you are, you know, it's very hard for you in a country, in Nigeria, to get a prosecution of the highest official on corruption charges. But if there's a continental court to do that, if there's an asset recovery mechanism for all the money that is lost and that is getting out of the continent and going into private bank accounts in Europe and whatnot, it would really help in responding to the looting problem in Africa. So I think that's important, because governance is an enabler for development or an impediment for development.
All right. Well, we'd like to say a very big thank you to you. One thing is, definite. This conversation is ongoing. I'd like to say a big thank you to you for your time, Phaladi.